In the winter of 1815, a 26-year-old black woman died alone in a cold room in Paris, thousands of miles from home. She had no family, there was no funeral, and she wasn't even buried. In fact, what happened next was so disturbing, so deliberate, and so public that it would take the world 187 years to even begin to make it right. Her name was Sarah Baartman, and when she was just a teenager, someone looked at her and decided she was worth more as a product than as a person. This is her story. Hey, welcome to Black Crime Noir. I'm T, and if you're new here, this channel is dedicated to true crime stories centered on Black experiences, the cases, the lives, the histories that got buried under the weight of who was considered important enough to mourn. Subscribe and hit the bell icon because every week we dig up the truth together. Now let's get into it. To understand what happened to Sarah Baartman, you have to first understand who she was before the world got its hands on her. Because she had a life, a real one, full of grief, yes, but also of love, of community, of identity. She was born around 1789 near the Gamtoos River in what is now the Eastern Cape of South Africa. She belonged to the Gonakwa sub, a subgroup of the Khoikhoi people, a proud ancient community of cattle herders who had lived in that region for thousands of years. Her Khoikhoi name was Sahura. I want you to hold on to that name because almost everyone in this story is going to call her something else, something they chose, something that served them. But her name, the one she was born with, the one her mother gave her, was Sahura. Her mother died when she was just 2 years old. Her father, a cattle driver, died when she was still a teenager. By the time she was 16, Sahura had already known more loss than most people face in a lifetime. But then came the thing that broke something permanently. She had a fiancé, a man she loved, and one day, in the brutal, grinding machinery of Dutch colonial expansion through Khoikhoi lands, he was murdered by Dutch colonists, just like that. There was no justice, no inquiry, no consequence, just absence where a person used to be. Sahura was still a teenager, and from that moment, she was alone in a way that made her vulnerable to everything that came next. The Khoikhoi people were being absorbed by force into a colonial labor system they never agreed to. They were pushed off their grazing land, their cattle were seized, their way of life was dismantled piece by piece, and if they resisted, they died. Shortly after her fiancé was killed, Sahura was sold into slavery to a Dutch trader named Pieter Willem Caesar, who took her to Cape Town, where she became a domestic servant in the home of his brother, Hendrik Caesar. She cooked, she cleaned, she survived. But Cape Town in the early 1800s was not freedom, it was just a different cage. And soon someone was going to see her in that cage and decide she was worth more on display. Around 1810, a British ship surgeon named Alexander Dunlop arrived at the Cape. He was visiting the Kaiser household when he first encountered Sahura. He didn't see a woman, he saw a business opportunity. Dunlop had noticed something about her body that he believed Europeans would pay to gawk at. She had a condition called steatopygia, a significant accumulation of fat around the hips and buttocks, which is a naturally occurring trait in many Khoikhoi and San women. She also had a physical characteristic that colonizers had developed a deeply racist and sexualized obsession with: elongated labia, which they referred to with deliberately dehumanizing language. In Europe, this was treated as proof of some invented theory about African women's hypersexuality. Dunlop and Hendrik Caesar made a plan. They would take Sahura to England. Now, this is where historians and scholars still debate, and I want to be honest with you about this because this story is complicated. and doing justice to it means telling the whole truth. There are accounts that suggest Sahura was presented with a contract, a document that allegedly promised her a share of the earnings from exhibition's medical care and return passage to South Africa after 5 years. She was reportedly told she could become wealthy. Here is the thing: she could not read. The contract was written in English and Dutch. She signed it, or rather made her mark on it. She did not fully understand what she was agreeing to. And even if the terms on paper were what they claimed, the lived reality of what followed made clear that the contract was, at best, a legal fiction designed to protect the men exploiting her. In 1810, Sahura, now being called Saatchi by the Dutch, a diminutive and patronizing nickname, boarded a ship to England with Dunlop and Cesar. She was approximately 21 years old. She was leaving behind the only continent she had ever known, the graves of her parents, the land where her people had lived for thousands of years. And she was carrying only one thing that mattered to her: a small tortoise-shell necklace. She arrived in London in the autumn of 1810. Almost immediately, she was put on display. The first exhibition was at a private residence, the Egyptian Hall at the London home of a wealthy collector on Duchess Street. The premise was simple and hideous. Paying audiences could come and stare at a living African woman, marvel at her body, poke at her if they wished, and leave satisfied that they had seen something exotic. She wore very little. She was made to walk around a small stage, to stand, to sit, to turn. She was compared to animals in the promotional materials. They called her the Hottentot Venus. Hottentot was a Dutch colonial slur for the Khoikhoi people. Venus, the Roman goddess of love and beauty, was used mockingly, ironically, in a way that was designed to both sexualize and degrade her. She became famous almost immediately. London was fascinated. Newspapers wrote about her. Cartoonists drew her, exaggerating her features in ways that were grotesque and deliberately dehumanizing. Upper-class Londoners came in their finest clothes to stare at her as if she were an animal in a zoo. Working-class people saved their pennies to see her on tour. She was a sensation, and she was miserable. Think about what that life actually looked like from the inside. Every day she woke up in a foreign country whose language she was still learning, whose cold she had never experienced before, whose people looked at her the way you look at something in a glass case. Every day she was dressed or undressed and placed on a stage. People walked around her, they pointed, they reached out and touched her without asking. She stood there and endured it, and then she did it again the next day, and the day after that. Word of the exhibition spread quickly, and not everyone in London was comfortable with it. British abolitionists, members of the African Association, were disturbed by what they were hearing. In 1810, the slave trade had technically been abolished in Britain, and there was a growing moral consciousness in the country about human rights. When these abolitionists investigated the exhibition of Sahura, they believed they were witnessing a woman being held against her will. They took legal action. The case went to court in 1810. The Attorney General launched an inquiry. This was genuinely remarkable. The British legal system was being asked to examine whether a black African woman was being held and displayed against her will. And then came the moment that historians have puzzled over ever since. Sahura was brought to testify, and she said she was not being mistreated. She said she had come to England of her own free will. She said she was comfortable. Pieter Cesar's brother produced the contract. The court ruled in favor of the exhibitors. The case was dismissed. Now, here's what I need you to sit with for a moment, because this is not a simple "she was fine" moment. Think about who was in that courtroom. Think about the power dynamics. Sahura stood in a British court, in a foreign country whose language she was still learning, surrounded by the men who controlled every aspect of her life, her food, her shelter, her money, her movement. The same men who held the contract she couldn't read. The same men who had the power to abandon her thousands of miles from home. What choice did she really have? What would have happened to her if she had said otherwise? The abolitionists who tried to free her meant well, genuinely. But the truth is that the legal system they worked within was not designed to protect a woman like her. And the outcome of that trial didn't free her. It just gave her captors a legal shield, and it made her even more famous. The publicity from the court case, the controversy, the newspaper coverage, the public debate increased demand to see her. She was taken on tours across England. By 1812, she had appeared as far away as Limerick, Ireland. She was a commodity and the market was growing. 4 years passed, 4 years of exhibitions, of being displayed, stared at, mocked in caricature and reduced to her body. 4 years of that tortoiseshell necklace pressed against her skin, her one connection to who she had been before all of this. In September 1814, everything shifted. Hendrik César transported her to France, and then, at the border of France or upon arrival in Paris, the accounts vary slightly. He sold her. Not traded, not transferred, sold. He sold Sehura to a man named Rio, an animal trainer, a man who made his living displaying wild creatures to paying crowds. Think about it. The man who brought her to Europe, the man whose household she had worked in, who had stood beside her in that British courtroom, who had used her labor and her body for 4 years, sold her to a man who handled animals. And Rio treated her accordingly. In Paris, she was exhibited in a cage. Her trainer, because that is literally what Rio was called, her trainer, would order her to sit or stand, the way you'd command an animal in a circus. She was often displayed almost completely naked. The only clothing she was permitted was a small loincloth, and according to accounts, she had insisted on even that much, because what it covered was, to her, culturally sacred. They allowed her that. Now Paris was even more brutal than London. Evidence suggests that at some point, a collar was placed around her neck. She was sometimes displayed at the Palais Royal, the famous entertainment district, where she would have been surrounded by the sounds of laughter and music from people who were free. Evidence also suggests that Rio allowed patrons to sexually abuse her for a fee. She was living in poverty. There are accounts that suggest she had turned to alcohol, not surprising given that her entire existence had been stripped down to surviving one day at a time. She was sick. She was desperately, unmistakably sick. And then one day, a scientist came to see her. His name was Georges Cuvier. He was one of the most respected and influential naturalists in the world. The father of paleontology, a man whose work shaped modern biology. He was a senior figure at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, the National Museum of Natural History, and he wanted to examine Sehura. Cuvier had heard about the exhibition. He visited the Palais Royal, saw her, and decided she was a subject of significant scientific interest. He asked Rio for access to her, and Rio agreed. From March 1815 onward, Sehura was subjected to examination by Cuvier and a group of French anatomists, zoologists, and physiologists. They measured her, they documented her, they made drawings. Cuvier's interest was in building a theory of racial hierarchy through comparative anatomy, using physical measurements to rank human beings on a scale, with Europeans at the top and African people at the bottom. Sehura's body, in his eyes, was evidence. She was 25 or 26 years old, exhausted, exploited, and sick, and she was being examined by some of the most celebrated scientists in Europe as if she were a geological specimen. At one point, Cuvier tried to examine her genitalia up close. She refused. They documented her refusal in their scientific notes, casually, the way you'd note a variable in an experiment. The examinations concluded. Cuvier published preliminary reports. He compared her to primates, to ancient peoples, to every non-European group he could think of, all in service of the argument that African people were less evolved, less human, less deserving of dignity. It was science in the service of colonialism, and it was completely accepted. Sehura died on December 29, 1815. She was 26 years old. The exact cause of her death has never been definitively established. Historical records suggest a combination of factors: an inflammatory illness, possibly pneumonia, possibly complicated by smallpox or syphilis. Some accounts mention alcoholism as a contributing factor. She had been in declining health for months. What is documented is this: she died alone, in poverty, in a foreign city, far from the Gamtoos River and the people of the Khoikhoi. She never made it home. But there is one thing I keep coming back to through everything, The ship to England, the exhibition stages, the cage in Paris, the examinations, the years of poverty and sickness and abuse, she had kept that small tortoiseshell necklace, the one scholars believe came from her mother. The mother she lost at 2 years old, whose face she probably couldn't remember, whose voice was gone before Sahura was old enough to hold on to it. She had carried that necklace across an ocean and through all of it. It was the one thing nobody had taken from her, the one thing that still said, I came from somewhere. I belong to someone. I had a name before any of you gave me one. She died with it. And within hours, Georges Cuvier came for her body. Georges Cuvier obtained her body from local police. He dissected her and made a plaster cast of her entire body. He removed her brain, he removed and preserved her genitalia. He placed them in jars of formaldehyde. He then wrote and published a full anatomical report, the one he had been building toward since those examinations earlier that year, complete with detailed descriptions of her body, her features, her anatomy. It was presented as science. It was celebrated as science. And then her remains went on display. At the Musée de l'Homme, the Museum of Man, in Paris, visitors could view the preserved genitalia and brain of Sarah Baartman. Her plaster cast stood in the exhibition hall. People walked past her. They looked. They moved on. And this continued for decades. Her remains were on public display at the Musée de l'Homme until 1974. Some accounts suggest elements remained accessible to researchers until as late as 1985. That is 159 years of violation. 159 years after the last breath left her body, visitors to a Paris museum could still view the physical remains of a woman who had been sold, caged, examined against her will, and never permitted to go home. And for most of those years, almost nobody said a word. The conversation about returning Sarah Baartman's remains to South Africa began as early as the 1940s. Anti-apartheid activists and scholars had known about her story for years. But the political climate made formal requests impossible. Then, in 1994, something changed. Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa. One of the first things he did was make a formal request to the French government to return the remains of Sarah Baartman to her homeland. The French government said no. The Musée de l'Homme had placed her remains in storage by then. They were no longer actively on display. But France's position was that the remains were the property of the museum, and French law protected museum collections from being deaccessioned. A woman's brain and genitalia were classified as museum property. So South Africa waited and pushed and negotiated. And then in 2002, after 8 years of formal requests, international pressure, and eventually a special act of the French Parliament, France agreed. On March 6, 2002, Sarah Baartman's remains were returned to South Africa. There were negotiations even in those final weeks, disputes over exactly which remains would be included, over the condition of her bones, over documentation. It was not clean, it was not graceful. But they came home. On August 9, 2002, Women's Day in South Africa, Sarah Baartman was buried near Hankie, in the Eastern Cape province, near the Gamtoos River, near where she was born. She was buried with ceremony, with song, with the dignity that had been systematically stripped from her for 187 years. President Thabo Mbeki gave the eulogy. He spoke about her suffering, yes, but he also spoke about who she was, not the exhibit, not the Hottentot Venus, not the specimen in Cuvier's report. The woman, Sahura, the girl who lost her mother at 2, who lost her father in adolescence, who had a fiancé murdered by colonizers, who married a Khoikhoi drummer and had a baby who didn't survive, who was sold, who survived England, who stood in a British courtroom surrounded by men who owned her and still somehow found the words to keep herself together, who refused Cuvier's most invasive examination even when she had almost nothing left to refuse with, who carried that small tortoiseshell necklace across an ocean and through years of exhibition and poverty and abuse. That woman came home, and here is something I want to leave you with. Because in this story, among all the men who bought and sold and displayed and dissected, there is one small, quiet detail that has stayed with me since the first time I read it. That tortoiseshell necklace. Scholars believe it was given to her by her mother, the mother who died when Suhura was 2 years old. She probably had almost no memory of her, but she carried that necklace and held on to it until she died. Sarah Baartman's story did not end at her burial in 2002. Her name now belongs to shelters for abused women in South Africa. There are scholarships in her name. There is academic work, art, film, and music created to honor her and reckon with what was done to her. But the reason I wanted to tell you her story today, the reason it belongs on this channel, is that her story isn't just about one woman. It is about what happens when a system decides that certain people are less than, when science and law and entertainment all agree to look the other way. If this story moved you, subscribe, share, and drop a comment telling me what part of her story stayed with you. These stories deserve to be heard. I'll see you in the next one.